Hello, everyone. Today I will be discussing Engel V Vitale, which was argued on April 3rd, 1962, and was decided on June 25th of the same year. This case takes place in New York, where the State Board of Regents, a government agency created by the state constitution, which is in charge of the supervision of all educational activities within the state of New York, instructed the Board of Education of Union Free School District Number 9 in New Hyde Park, New York, who then instructed the principal of said school to instill the Regent's Prayer after the Pledge of Allegiance every morning at school. And that prayer read, "Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country." This prayer was led by a teacher who was paid to do so, and the state made sure to offer students the freedom to not recite the prayer or to leave the room while the prayer took place. No school official was allowed to pressure the students to join the prayer. However, after learning about the new procedure, 10 parents came forward and claimed that this prayer violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which commands that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And this is made applicable to the state of New York by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. The New York Court of Appeals agreed with the decision of the lower state courts, which ordered that the state has the power to have the prayer as a part of the daily procedure, as long as the schools did not require students to join in the prayer over his objections or their parents' objections. However, the Supreme Court disagreed with the two lower courts, and in a 6-1 decision, overturned the ruling. Now, Justice Black, delivering the majority opinion, said that by encouraging students to recite the Regent's Prayer, the state of New York violated the Establishment Clause by establishing religious activity, and that the nature of the prayer is without a doubt a religious one. The Board of Regents agree that it has religious roots, but wants the court to acknowledge it because of our spiritual roots. Parents, on the other hand, argue that since the prayer was made by government officials as a part of a government program to further religious beliefs, that this would breach the separation of church and state, and the court agreed, and was of the mind that the government has no business to put together prayers as a part of a government program. Justice Black goes on to delve into the United States history with religion and goes all the way back to the first colonists leaving England to find religious freedom in America. In 1785 to 1786, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison worked to enact the Virginia Bill for Religious Liberty, which put all religious groups on the same footing within the state. And when the time of the Constitution came, similar laws were in effect in various states, and there was a consensus that there needed to be a barrier between church and state. The colonists realized that when one group is acknowledged over another, it causes a battle to be waged over who will come out on top, and thus the First Amendment was made to avoid all of this and leave the question of religion out of the hands of the government. And the Founding Fathers saw no reason for the American people to be pressured about their chosen religion with a change of leadership, such as in England at the time. The instillment of the Regent's Prayer in a school setting while being a part of a government program is completely in contrast with the Founders' wishes. And even if it is non-denominational and does not require students to participate in, it still violates the Establishment Clause. When the government backs a certain program which backs a certain religion, there's a pressure to other religious groups to go along with that religion instead of their own. And when church and state are combined, there's an inevitable result of hatred and contempt for minorities with beliefs that differ from the government-backed religion, and persecution is bound to follow. Now, moving forward, there was a concurring opinion written by Justice Douglas, and in his eyes, the problem at hand in this case is whether or not the government, under the Constitution, can finance a religious exercise. He contrasts this case to McCollum v. Board of Education, but argues that it does not decide the case at hand, since in McCollum, public school facilities were used for the religious education of students. Now, in Engel, students were given the option to not take part or leave the assembly during the prayer without any comment from their teachers on their participation. Whereas in McCollum, absences were reported to teaching staff. And although in Engel, school facilities were used and the teaching staff was used to lead the prayer, there was never a direct effort made by the school to persuade or pressure the students to embrace a certain religion. And he compares the opening procedure of the school to that of the Supreme Court, Congress, and the Senate. The convening of the court has always been opened by the court's crier, who cries out, "God save the United States and this honorable court." Now, the justices are no more compelled to join in that prayer than the students. And the House and the Senate both have chaplains who are paid to do prayers within their respective legislative halls. Now, to Justice Douglas, both are the same. And I quote, "No matter how briefly the prayer is said, for in each of the instances given, the person praying is a public official on the public payroll performing a religious exercise in a governmental institution." End quote. He does not agree that by allowing these prayers we establish a religion, but does agree that once the government finances such a religious exercise, it influences the community. And the First Amendment was created to force the government into a neutral position, not a position of hostility, so as to support all religions equally. He then quotes from McGowan v. Maryland, and I quote, "If a religious leaven is to be worked into the affairs of our people, it is to be done by individuals and groups, not by the government." End quote. Justice Douglas then touched on Everson v. Board of Education. In that case, taxpayer money was used to pay for the bus fares of kids, and the vast majority of these kids attended private Christian schools, which in his eyes violates the First Amendment, but was allowed by the Supreme Court of the time because it wasn't specified to be for only Christian schools, but for all the schools in the area. He not only disagreed with that decision, but also disagreed with the conduct of New York in this case. Now that I've finished discussing the majority's opinion on the case, I'd like to finish off with the sole dissenting opinion written by Justice Stewart. He argues that New York didn't interfere with anyone's freedom of religion, since the school provided for students to not participate while being free of any judgment and were never pressured to recite the prayer. He especially takes issue with the court's interpretation that by allowing kids to recite the prayer, they were establishing an official religion. By taking away the opportunity to recite the prayer, the court also strips the students of any chance to celebrate the spiritual heritage of the United States. And to him, the court's argument over the history of England and the rejection of an official church here in the States is an off-topic argument because this case isn't about an official church. Instead, it's about whether kids who would like to recite a prayer at school can or cannot. And the main focus and relevant topic of the case is the history of the religious traditions of the American people. He, too, brings up the opening prayer before the court's proceedings begin, and the House and Senate's own prayers. And another point of interest is that the vast majority of presidents, when assuming office, have prayed for the help and protection of God. And the court brought up that the government lacks constitutionally backed power to create any forms of words that are be repeated by the American people, but Justice Stewart argues that the Star-Spangled Banner begs to differ. And I quote, "Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust." End quote. He goes on to add that Congress added the phrase, "one nation under God, indivisible with liberty and justice for all," to the Pledge of Allegiance. They request the president to choose the National Day of Prayer each year. And finally, he adds that for around 150 years, the words "in God we trust" have been engraved on United States currency. And the point here is that religion is extremely linked to American spiritual tradition, and to deprive unpressured and willing students to take up that tradition is out of bounds. Furthermore, by doing all these things, the government hasn't established any type of official religion, and neither has the state of New York in this case, but instead they've attempted to recognize and celebrate the spiritual tradition of the United States. Thank you all for listening, and that concludes my presentation.